Let me first thank Natasha and Alicia because these two women have grown up in the last 4 or 5 months from neophytes at best in the arena of community activism to real professionals. We help steer some of us who have been at this for a number of years helped steer them along the way for the first few events, but now they're just coasting and doing it all on their own. So they're to be congratulated, and all of you should take the opportunity to thank them for what they've been doing. I'm going to take just a few minutes to try and deal with a subject that's very complex and not very pleasant, and I don't want to steal any thunder from our main guest. So I'm going to narrow my focus on the health consequences of this incinerator to a very narrow and limited scope. And I want to warn you that this talk can be extremely hazardous to your peace of mind. It's not very pleasant. You're not going to go out singing a tune, but I want you to go out making some chants here when we're done in about a half an hour. It being the Halloween season, I've renamed Stericycle Scary Cycle. For a very good reason. That's what we're actually going to talk about. Stericycle is literally a poison factory. Now maybe that sounds a little harsh, but there's really no other appropriate way to describe it. And we're going to talk about why that's the case. Now, I'm not going to dive into hundreds and hundreds of medical studies, but just suffice it to say, obviously this is an aerial view of Stericycle. The scientific evidence is very clear that facilities like this cause serious harm to the surrounding community, and it's as undeniable as the evidence that smoking causes lung cancer. So if anybody says to you, how can you prove these outcomes are from this incinerator? It's the same level of proof by which we tell patients you should stop smoking because it will kill you in various ways, lung cancer being only one of them. This is the permit for Stericycle in terms of some of the heavy metals that they are allowed to emit, and we know from the events of the last 3 or 4 months that they emit more than that. Lead 130 pounds, chlorine 912 pounds, cadmium 18 pounds, mercury 60 pounds, who knows how much dioxin, because their permit, they've exceeded their permit in emissions of dioxins by hundreds of times, and even hydrofluoric acid, which basically eats out your lungs. The total amount of HAPs, which is an acronym for hazardous air pollutants, which the EPA has designated as such because these are the most hazardous substances known to man. They're allowed to emit 9.51 tons per year, and we know that that's obviously an underestimation of what actually happens. Dioxins are the second most toxic man-made substance known after plutonium. Now you may see a little parlor game played by representatives of industry where they'll hold up a little plastic bag about half full and they'll say, this is all the dioxins that we're going to emit at this facility. It only takes about 1/1,000,000th of a gram of exposure to some of these substances to cause a fatal cancer. So this little parlor trick about how much we emit has no bearing whatsoever on what the real health consequences to the community are. Now, that slide's a little bit washed out, obviously, but it's a view of another Stericycle bypass taken in April to illustrate the point that dioxins produced during startups and shutdowns can be twice as great as the annual dioxins emissions that occur during steady-state conditions. Studies in other incinerators are very clear that these bypass or upsets or startup and shutdown events for a typical incinerator actually amount to about 10% of their operating time. So it's actually a much bigger deal than just, oh, it's a one-time event, it looks terrible, and it certainly does, but it is also profoundly toxic, and it is extremely toxic given the fact that emissions that occur for even just a few minutes like this can exceed what exists throughout the rest of the year. Now, this is extremely disturbing, but it's actually the scientific truth. A newborn baby on day 1 enters the world with over 200 chemicals and heavy metals perfusing its blood and every single organ that it has, virtually the minute that it takes its first breath. 200 chemicals. I can tell you that none of those chemicals and heavy metals enhance that individual's opportunity to have a healthy life. 134 of those chemicals are known to cause cancer. 151 are known to cause birth defects. 154 endocrine disruption. And 158 neurotoxins. Now, those of you who are quick at math know that that adds up to a lot more than 200, and that's because a lot of those substances have multiple effects. Studies of the urine of human beings reveal that each one of us has in us, probably when we're adults, well over 2,000 chemicals in our blood perfusing all of our organs. Some of them include endocrine disrupting chemicals like PCBs, pesticides, and dioxins that are coming out of the smokestack. And they occur in concentrations as high as the body's own sex hormones. Well, what does that mean? Well, if you look at this particular organism here, I'm going to call that an organism. That's going to maybe take the liberty with the term. But the difference between this organism and this organism is not necessarily hours and hours spent in the gym. It's actually sex hormones that would not fill a grain of sand in volume. The body's sex hormones are the most powerful biologic agents that we know of. And endocrine disrupting chemicals that mess with these are that powerful. Now we know the 1/1000th of previously recommended safe dosages of hormone mimickers, another word for endocrine disruptors, are known to create genetic malfunctions and precancerous conditions in the laboratory and individual cells. Well, how can this affect you? Let's just take one adverse health outcome. Utah has the highest rates of autism in the nation, double the national average. 1 in every 32 Utah boys now is diagnosed with autism, and 1 in every 85 Utah girls. Studies from Stanford University show that about 1/3 of it is probably genetic predisposition, and about 2/3 are environmental exposure. So it's usually a combination of the two. At the top of the list of those environmental exposures, known as best we can to trigger this sort of outcome, are heavy metals and many of the things that come out of this smokestack. The fact that our government and our community at large is doing nothing to address this problem, when Utah has the highest rates not only in the country, but in the world. We're tied with South Korea for the highest rates of autism, and we're doing nothing about it. It's literally a crime against our children. In addition to autism, we know that exposure to these kinds of chemicals and heavy metals cause lower intelligence, attention deficit and behavioral disorders, more addictive behavior, depression, higher rates of strokes, multiple sclerosis, Parkinson's disease, microscopic changes in brain tissue indicative of Alzheimer's, and an acceleration of the cognitive decline that naturally occurs with aging. This is a statement about 4 days ago from the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists. Mainstream medical communities now are coalescing around this idea that the environment or environmental contaminants actually cause disease. They said from mercury to pesticides, Americans are exposed daily to environmental chemicals that can harm reproductive health. And by reproductive health, you should mean harm the future health of that baby and subsequent generations. The nation's largest groups of obstetricians and fertility specialists said on Monday that doctors should be pushing for stricter environmental policies to better identify and reduce exposure to chemicals that prove truly risky. They're asking other doctors to speak out about this and try and enact public policy that changes this equation. That's what we're doing. This is a statement made a few years ago by another group of specialists called the Endocrine Society, and they are the specialists. They're internal medicine doctors that specialize in endocrinology. They treat and specialize in diseases of the thyroid, diabetes, and things like that. They said, with regard to chemicals that act as endocrine disruptors, even infinitesimally low levels of exposure, indeed any level of exposure at all, may cause endocrine or reproductive abnormalities, particularly if the exposure occurs during a critical developmental window. Surprisingly, low doses may exert even more potent effects than higher doses. So, here's about a 1.5-minute lesson in biology. Epigenetics is replacing the gene as biology's center of the universe. And you can think of epigenetics this way. If you have a musician who's playing the violin is the genotype, the 20,000 genes that make up an individual. The musician is the epigenetic influence over those genes. And the phenotype is the music that comes out. That's how the organism is expressed. That's your personage. That's your personality, your intelligence. That's your state of health. If you break the violin or damage chromosomes, the music's over. But if the violinist breaks her fingers or forgets the music, the effect is the same. What we now know is it takes infinitesimally smaller amounts of chemical exposure to affect the epigenetic profile of an individual compared to the genetic profile, but the effect can be virtually the same. This study published just recently said researchers have for the first time shown that the environment experienced in the womb defines the newborn epigenetic profile, the chemical modifications to DNA that we are all born with. And this likely affects a person's lifetime risk for multiple diseases. Epigenetic changes can be passed on to future generations. This is a concept I really want to drive home. Children are the current users of genes and an epigenetic profile through which all future generations must pass. So this is a study done by one of the most prominent environmental research groups in the country out of Columbia School of Public Health, where they found that women who are exposed to more air pollution during pregnancy give birth to children who have 50% more chromosomal damage compared to children whose mothers grew up breathing less air pollution. Pollution causes alterations in the functioning of genes, turning them on or off inappropriately with prolonged and potentially a lifelong effect capable of being passed on to subsequent generations. And studies with cigarette smoke, which is just another kind of pollution, show that these epigenetic changes, these changes in your chromosomes, can occur literally within minutes after exposure. This statement from the world's premier medical journal a couple of years ago regarding people who are exposed to the Gulf oil spill. Pregnant women should particularly avoid dermal contact with oil and should avoid areas with visible oil contamination or odors. Have any of you smelled any odors around here? From any of the sources of industry? They go on to state, every molecule of a carcinogen is presumed to pose a risk. This is the world's premier medical journal. In sum, a woman's short-term exposure to low-level pollution can affect the health of multiple generations, and the relevant exposure can actually precede conception. There are 40,000 women who are pregnant at any one time in the state of Utah. This is a satellite photo of the roof of Stericycle before they scrubbed it down. So, there is no safe level of exposure to many of the toxic components of Stericycle's emissions. If we fail to protect our children and future generations, we have failed as a society. Let me close with this quote from the great abolitionist Frederick Douglass from the 19th century. Find out just what any people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of the injustice and wrong which will be imposed upon them. I'm going to adapt that to our circumstance today. find out just how much pollution people will quietly submit to, and you have found the exact measure of pollution, injustice, and wrong which will be imposed upon them. So, we're here today to state that we will no longer quietly submit to what Stericycle is putting in our community. It's time to shut it down.